Oh, yeah. So thank you, everybody, for giving me the opportunity to present my work today. So I am a second-year PhD student, and I am presenting one of my ongoing research projects, which is about the renovation obligation. So this work was made at CIRED in France with my PhD supervisor, which is Louis-Gaëtan Giraudet. So first of all, I will be quick about that. We have seen the first presentation of the IPCC results and the residential sector, and so more generally the building sector has a huge mitigation potential in high-income countries. And there is also a shared belief that this potential can be achieved with cost-effective investments. And so every country sets some national targets to achieve this potential. And in Europe, we have the Fit for 55, and also in France, we have this 500,000 renovation a year, which is now 700,000 from the last election. And so what we can see is like we are not doing it, we are not making it. And all the econometric studies and so ex post studies shows that actually most incentive programs that we try to implement to achieve this potential wasn't working. And so it's very linked to what we said just before. So in 2005, nice tax credit programs that was actually covering to 30% of the upfront costs of the renovation shows that it was only benefiting the non-additional participants, so a high rate of free riders. Then the zero interest lane, which is like you can get a free loan actually, was targeted to create like 400,000 renovation by year, and only 40,000 has been made. And finally, and maybe the most famous one, is a carbon tax that triggered the yellow vest crisis in France. So if we have all these incentive programs that is not actually really well working, what do we need to do? And the Citizen Convention for Climate Change made a central proposal, which is a renovation obligation. It is the obligation for homeowners and landlords to renovate their building when there is a new lease or a new sale. But it may be impossible for low-income households to pay for this very expensive renovation cost. So they created a backup subsidy programs that is going to cover to 90% for very low income, to 30% for medium and high income households. And here, my research question today is to say, how can we practically impose this policy? And is the cost for the policy is going to outweigh the benefit? So I will be very quick on the methodology, but I am very pleased to answer any question after that. So we use a micro-simulation model that is going to represent different households in France. Each household is a combination of a dwelling and an owner. And from that, we can actually estimate, from a bottom-up perspective, the energy consumption of the French dwelling stock. What we integrate to is a heating behavior, because we know there is a price elasticity demand. So high-income households will consume more than low-income households. So that is a very static point start, and then we had some dynamic. So we had the fact that there is a demolition and a construction rate, but it is actually pretty slow. And even though we are demolishing the worst efficient and replacing it by very efficient building, it's not enough. And so we add the last step, which is the retrofitting decision of each individual homeowners based on the economic environment, the cost, the subsidies, and the energy prices. And dynamically, we can then estimate and forecast actually the energy consumption based on different scenarios and assumptions. So I say that we are describing the building stock. So we are starting from this description. So the first row is actually describing the dwelling by its energy performance, but also the housing type and the heating energy the household is using. And then we are also, because we want to assess the distributivity of each policies, we need to integrate the income of the tenant, of the owner, and the occupation status. So one, in a nutshell, very key processes. For the renovation decision, we use an extensive, we use a logistic function of the net present value, but we are going really to explicitly integrate all the market barriers and market failures that make renovation very difficult. So the landlord-tenant dilemma is included. We also model the friction in collective decision-making in multifamily dwelling. We also integrate credit constraint. So we are trying to be as close as we can and explicitly modeling these market barriers. Finally, the choice, so what we call the intensive margin, this means what kind of renovation work is going to be made by the homeowners, is modeled by the discrete choice model that I think we will see more in the next session. And finally, this model has been validated by global sensitivity analysis, by backtesting. We showed that it's actually reproducing well the past trends. And I think, one key thing for me is that this model is open source and the documentation is available. We are using open source programming language, which is Python. And so really it's, we are trying to make it ready and useful for policymakers. How do we implement the retrofitting obligation in our model? So we say that after each new lease, the owner needs actually to renovate his building, and we put here, we set an agenda which is actually very close to what the convention proposed. And finally, that are the scenarios that I'm going to show you. So as we have seen in the first presentation, we need a counterfactual scenario to assess the policy. So we will have a current policy, which is the reference. Then we will have a scenario with the renovation obligation. Then with only the subsidy I showed you before, that was the backup subsidy programs. And finally, one with the obligation and the subsidy. So here is now how I integrate the renovation obligation. You owners have both the choice to make their own decision, or they need to do it, and it's mandatory for them because they are trying to make a new lease. And finally, the main indicator I will present for you today is a socioeconomic assessment. So this is actually a welfare analysis at a global level. I will consider the additional cost between the business as usual and the policy scenario, the difference in energy expenditures and emission avoided. And finally, I will show you, I will try to integrate the health cost, so which is one of the impact of policies and renovation. But as we say, there is like 15 of the SDGs that are impacted by renovation. I cannot actually implement all of them. And so we try to really select the ones that we think are the most impactful. And finally, I will use social discount rate used by public authorities in France to assess their policies and an investment horizon for renovation of 30 years. Okay, so let's go to the results. So I hope it's enough clear. So the red line is the reference scenario, and the yellow one is the obligation and the subsidies. And the purple one is only the obligation. And what we see is if we really want to target the worst efficient dwelling, we really need to put in place this renovation. Otherwise, the business as usual is not enough. Why? Because of the landlord-tenant dilemma, you will never achieve to target these specific households. And also because of the collective decision-making, which is very difficult, you really need to impose them. So we don't see any effectiveness of incentive policies and programs for those households. One key indicator is the energy poverty that is actually assessing the distributional effects of the policy. And here we see that is, so the energy poverty has been defined by energy to income ratio less than 10%. And we see between the red line and the yellow line, less than 200,000 households out of your poverty thanks to the renovation obligation. So which is huge, but compared to our ambition to reach 0 by 2030, still not enough. Finally, the renovation expenditures, and here we see that in the current policies we are spending like 15 to 20 billion of euros, and we think about an additional 4 to 6 to take into account the renovation obligation. And finally, the assessments, the socioeconomic assessment I explains in the methodology. Here we compare the cost, the investments to the benefits, energy, emission, and health. And here the NPV indicates social benefits of this policy. We also see that even the investment and the energy and emission are offsetting the investment, which was the case with old energy prices. So if I am doing the same simulation today, it will be even more positive. And finally, the health improvements, because it's really going to target low-income living in rental dwellings, is going to be very substantial and create extra benefits. Here I am just comparing some different scenarios. You have the subsidies, which is only the subsidy, and we see that it doesn't seem to get a social benefit. Why? Because it's targeting free riders and it's targeting high-income people, households. But when you are also using the renovation obligation, then you are targeting the less efficient and the rental sector, and so you get a social, you get a positive social assessment. And finally, the obligation by himself doesn't seem very realistic, because it doesn't make sense that people would pay for 100% of the renovation cost. So it's just there to compare. Okay, so I will just put you some policies takeaway. Here we made a very specific specification of the renovation obligation, but we can also think about more specification, and we need to test it to find maybe what is going to be the most important. The renovation was always trying to, there is a threshold, so each homeowner need to renovate to the EPC B, which is very intensive. So we think that maybe it could be good to test other specification. The outcomes is like we hear 200,000 more retrofits a year, and we are very eliminating energy poverty and the renovation in the rental housing. And finally, we find a socioeconomic balance net positive with a very good impact of health benefits. So what I just mentioned is that we need to make other scenarios about the performance threshold, but also sensitivity analysis. We may also try to understand what could be the best subsidy program, so to determine the subsidy backrupt programs. And because it's a partial equilibrium models, it is true to say that we are not considering the friction of the renovation industries that need to provide all these new demands. So maybe some industrial friction and bottlenecks could be a great start. Then also the high demand on loan is going to make some impact on the real estate markets that needs to be considered, and on the credit market, of course. Okay, so thank you for listening, and I am pleased to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you. So is there any question? Yeah, please.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for a very interesting presentation and research topic. I would have two questions. The first one, you mentioned that you look at frictions in multifamily buildings. So could you provide a bit more detail what type of frictions you look at? And the second question, maybe about richer processes that you could consider. I was wondering, have you thought about the turnover rate being potentially impacted itself by a retrofit obligation, which in turn could lead to an overestimation of the effects of a retrofit obligation? So just a thought I had that could maybe enrich the analysis, if that would make sense to you as well.
Yes, so for the first question, we implemented by saying that the homeowners can only capitalize the renovation, the energy saving with only 3 years, when homeowners can do it with 30 years, because it's only the time, the contract time. So it's not perfect, but then we calibrate it on real data, and we find that we are finding the good renovation rate by occupation status, by housing time for your question, but it's actually the same for occupation status. The second question is a good one. We didn't think about that. So what you say is maybe like, because of the renovation obligation, landlords don't want to make a new lease, but how are they going to force tenants to keep their building? So yeah. No, actually, that may be true. Yes, but here I am just presenting, and I think it was unclear, but we did it for sale and lease, but here we are really targeting the rental sector. But okay, yeah, thank you for the suggestion. I will try to think about that.
Thank you. Another question? Yeah.
Yes. My name is Robert from Utrecht University. Thanks for the nice presentation. Actually, I have just a question for clarification. So slide 14 was intriguing me, but you went a little bit fast. So yeah, this one. So can you, for maybe 2 labels, explain the shape of the curve, and especially label C should be one of them.
Yeah, of course. So the x-axis is the energy performance certificate of buildings in France. So the G are the worst efficient and the A are the most efficient dwelling. And what we see is that the worst efficient dwelling based on caused by the renovation are decreasing, and the most efficient dwelling are increasing. What we see with the C is like people are renovating to the C, and at the moment, the C buildings are also renovating their buildings to reach B and A because of the turnover rate.
Oh, okay.
Because of the renovation rate, sorry. So let's say you are in C, but now maybe you are going to need new windows that are going to be more efficient, so you may reach B.
It seems a little bit inefficient from a cost point of view that you, or is it just a stapling of measures so you don't, because sometimes if you renovate to label C and then you basically lock in certain type of measures, because if you move to label A, you need thicker insulation, for example, and then actually you can remove the label C insulation.
Yeah, actually I absolutely agree. So that is the 3.0 version of the model, and actually in the new version we are not talking about energy performance certificate, but we are really describing all the building with the wall insulation, the roof, the floor, and the windows. And in this model, I think you are right, it would be flat in C. So what I prefer to say with this model is like C, B, and A are efficient buildings, and the other one are not efficient. And actually not going into this detail, but because I think you are right, this model is not done for that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Lisa Groves from Ricardo AEA. I thought it was a really interesting presentation and aligns quite a lot with what we're seeing in the UK with similar kind of subsidy programs. I had 2 questions for that sort of further research. The first is it's not just about sort of bottlenecking within the supply chain, but also cost increases. Yeah. So it's a supply and a cost and a skills challenge to sort of increase the scale of retrofitting to the levels that are being modelled there. And the second one was really about thinking deeper into future readiness against hotter summers. So there's a real challenge that we're looking at in the UK around spending so much money to retrofit buildings to be better insulated. And actually one of the major challenges that isn't being seen on the ground from an evaluation perspective is planning to be able to deal with temperatures over 36 degrees regularly in the summer. And that's going to cause a real problem for the really well insulated houses once you get over 36 degrees. So that might be something interesting to think about.
Yeah. So one of our projects is actually trying to calibrate a model with the industrial bottleneck. So what we do is here we are modeling monopolistic renovation industry, and with the increasing of renovation, the margin of the renovation industry is going higher and higher because they have actually a lot of demand. So they say, I can increase my cost. And so we see that there is a friction. And so we cannot have a very exponential renovation. It's going yearly. And for the second one, yes, good remark. Thank you.
Thank you. So the way I'm understanding what you modeled is step-by-step renovation, right?
It depends, because if you start from G and you go to B, it's not step by step. It's so I was very quick on that, but there is an endogenous intensive margin, which is actually going to determine which renovation you are going to do. And there is a high heterogeneity. This means that some people are making the choice to go from G to F, and others from G to B. But we are seeing way more step renovations and global renovation, of course.
Yeah, but if France would like to meet its building renovation targets by 2050, so all the buildings should be renovated to A, not even to B. So I don't see the point of modeling something that does not match with the targets that we have. And then the other thing is, for me, my understanding is that you don't consider the option of industrialized renovation that would allow to go directly to A and reduce the costs. Because from my understanding, you are imagining that this renovation will take place like it is done today with these small companies.
Yeah, so I was very quick in the modeling. So I think it's interesting also to model not just the target, but what we see is happening, because it's actually the current policies, and we need it if we want to assess a policy between what is a new policy and what is actually going to be if we do nothing. And what we see today is, as you say, small gesture in renovation. So if we see that, I think it's good that is a reference scenario. That is a current policy scenario. We have only a small step. And for the other one, can you just repeat? Maybe I forgot.
The industrialization and versus.
Yeah, so we have actually a technical progress function that over time, so it's an iterative process. And in 2030, the cost for renovation is lower than in 2020. So we are considering the industrialization over time because of technical progress, some of them. And yes, to go from G to A in euro by kilowatt hour saved is lower than to go from G to F. So there is in our cost matrix this effect considering. Am I clear?
Thank you. Oh, last question. Two questions, short question, please.
Great. Thank you also for a really interesting presentation, David Kennington from UCL. And apologies if I missed this in your methodology section, but in the UK, with the rollout of smart meters, we're able to look at the actual energy demand of dwellings over different years. We're rapidly finding that there's a somewhat uncomfortable relationship between what smart meters tell us and the relationship with what EPC value it's been given from the assessment that it has had. And you can see this from charts which show that if you set policies to try and get to a minimum of C or B, which often we have policies set to do, we find a very large proportion of assessments are done which meet just over the threshold of C. And there is some gaming going on in our market. And I just wondered, within your modeling, whether you'd considered this is something that, in the discussion, of the relationships there and what happens in France. I'd be really interested to know.
So we see actually the same thing in France, where everybody is actually at the limit, at the border of the EPC. So yes, the actual consumption we are estimating here is not the one from the EPC. That's just the starting point. That's the standard energy consumption. And then we integrate the heating behavior of households. And one of the main determinants, drivers of that is the income. So we are saying that people that are richer can heat themselves better than others. So it's why also in the energy poverty, you have so much low-income people that cannot heat them enough. Yeah, I think that is answering, and I think it's also very important to integrate that in our modeling because it's also the rebound effect. That is because you're when you will be B, even if you are low income, you will tend to increase your consumption. And so the energy saved is not really what the EPC would tell you.
Okay, last question.
Thank you for your presentation. Did you plan, first of all, I like the assessment of the impact on fuel poverty. I think it's original issue. And do you plan to add two other multi-benefits, which is increase of comfort, which is a main reason, in fact, to make generally retrofitting, and secondly, a job creation? So it's simple answer, yes or no. Now, for practitioners, I have made an audit of my buildings. So just to understand, I have make a roof insulation, wall insulation, and I change my, I have triple glazing. You know how much am I rated? J. So how I can go with that from J to A? So it means that it's exactly what the question between Yasmin and you, between practitioners and, let's say, technocrats who make obligation. I don't know how to go to A.
And me too.
I have one question, an answer to that. Change the assessor of the EPC. Because you can, the EPC level depends on the assessor. Sorry, Lucas.
No, I think you're right. And I cannot really answer for your specific house. But I think if you are insulated everything, you should be more than G. For the first one, no, the job we are trying to integrate it in a broader model, macroeconomic model, where we can really impact the job creation, which is very difficult to do it in a partial equilibrium model. And for I know. Memphis model, we are very aware of that. And finally, yes. It's difficult, I think, to monetize the heat comfort, but one thing is also you can say the heat comfort is close to the energy prices, what people are willing to pay, and it's a proxy. I know it's not perfect, but I am happy if you have like some suggestion about how can we monetize heat comfort in utility functions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So next speaker, Owen Davis from Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and Alex Thornton from Kantar. So welcome. Oh, I will close this one. Okay. I suppose it's the good one. That's the one, yeah. Yeah, perfect. So, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Hear me okay? Yeah. So Alex and I, my colleague Alex is just saying up there, we'll sort of split the presentation, probably quite quickly actually at this stage. So, hi everyone, my name's Owen Davis. I'm a evaluator in BEIS, the UK Government of Business, UK Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And with my colleague Alex here today, we're going to talk to you about an evaluation that we've been running now for several years of the energy company obligation, which is known as ECO in sort of policy speak in the UK. So just to sort of briefly highlight the structure of this presentation. So we're going to start by providing a bit of UK context for those who are sort of less familiar, how the UK compares particularly to European countries, to Western European countries, and the current policy and strategy of the UK government towards retrofit, and how that fits within the broader net zero and fuel poverty strategies. I will then hand over to Alex, who will say a bit about the design of the eco policy, and also about the design of the evaluation which we've been working on, and then I will discuss the main findings from our evaluation and prompt a bit of a discussion. We've got a few sort of questions at the end for people in the room, and appreciate any thoughts. So first of all, UK context. We've got two images on this slide. The one on the left is, as you can see, a graphic showing the percentage of homes rated EPC A to G in England. This comes from the recently published heat and building strategy from my department. I suppose there's a couple of things which are apparent from this figure, and so this is from the last 15 years, but going back to 2019. You can see obviously we're going in the right direction. We've got a trend away from primarily a lot of EPC E or below rated properties towards a much higher proportion in the sort of higher categories. But while you can see we've got the growth particularly in bands EPC C has been quite dramatic over that 15-year period. There's still a lot of properties in that sort of EPC D category, and still some below that band as well. So it's clearly a long way to go in terms of improving our homes. And then on the right, you can see a quick an image there which gives some illustration, I suppose, of where the UK sits comparatively. And I think, and what this shows is the temperature loss from a home after 5 hours. And you can see the UK actually performs the worst of all of those countries there, with the sort of average loss of 3 degrees Celsius after 5 hours. And this is partly due to the housing stock we have in the UK. We have a lot of very old housing stock, which is still very inefficient. And so clearly both from a sort of an immediate policy perspective, and then in the wider context, we've got a long way to go. So what is the UK government's plans? As I said, the heat and building strategy is now the main strategic document that we have covering this, and this was published last year. And so just amongst other things, I've highlighted 4 kind of key aspects from this. I think the first one is about improving energy efficiency of homes, which is probably most relevant to this presentation. And so we have a target throughout this decade to improve the performance of particularly the poorest performing homes, which fits into our wider target of improving as many homes as possible to EPC band C by 2035. And this is to contribute to both our net zero by 2050 target and also our fuel poverty target. So the way that this is done in practice, so we have various schemes and programs which are targeted particularly at low-income households, to help to provide financial support schemes to help improve energy efficiency. We also have regulations which are targeted more at what we describe as the able-to-pay households, I suppose. We also will be phasing out new gas boilers from 2035, and sort of alongside this is more talking about what we describe as clean heat. So we also have an ambition to reduce the cost of heat pumps and to bring that technology down so it's comparable with or cheaper in the long run than gas boilers. And then we also, as part of this, new build properties will now be installed to high energy efficiency standards and fitted with low carbon heating. So we sort of have a particular objective around new builds. So I'm just going to hand over to Alex now to talk about the design of the policy itself.
Thank you. So I'm Alex Thornton, work for Kantar Public in the UK business. So worked with the Owens department on this evaluation. I'm going to start off by talking about the eco policy and how that fits within the overall strategy, which Owens just talked through. It's interesting that this follows on from the previous presentation because it seems like it has quite a lot of similarities to the French retrofitting programme. But to give a quick illustration of how the programme's delivered in Great Britain, it was launched just over 9 years ago, and it requires large energy providers to deliver energy efficiency and heating measures in homes with domestic properties. So basically offering subsidies so that the price is either subsidised or free to the consumer. The scheme's administered by Ofgem, so the energy regulator on behalf of the department. And I think the kind of key thing here is it's not an isolated policy. It sort of builds on a whole raft of similar obligations that have extended back well over a decade, including things like CERT, so that's the carbon emissions reduction target, basically requiring energy suppliers to be involved in this exercise to try and make homes more efficient. So yeah, real cornerstone of domestic energy policy within Great Britain. Two things to highlight. So similar to the French retrofitting programme, I think, is that it's focused both on homes which are less efficient. Clearly that's a clear priority, making more homes into the more efficient brackets, which Owens just talked through, but also focusing on households which are either in fuel poverty or at risk of fuel poverty, so trying to address issues around low income and disadvantage. So with that in mind, it's really all about reducing greenhouse emissions, but also lowering the cost of energy bills within that. So kind of two prongs to the policy. In terms of what that means about what's delivered through ECO, I think the kind of key thing here is that it's not a policy which is primarily about renewable or green energy. The measures are installed for the two reasons I've highlighted. So it's to keep homes warmer and to make it more comfortable to live in, which may also bring, for instance, health benefits, which the previous presentation touched on, and reducing energy bills, and with that, the carbon emissions that go with that. So sort of those two key elements. So to give an illustration, the types of measures which are covered by the obligation, it's a whole range, but typically the big ones are insulation measures, so cavity wall, loft insulation, but particularly replacement boilers, so trying to take inefficient boilers out of the market and offering replacements to make homes that much more efficient. But as I say, not primarily focused on renewable and green. The other thing to highlight is that some households will adopt more than one measure, and that's often to increase the efficiency further still. Obviously, there's a step change if you employ multiple measures. But it's also the case that to qualify for funding for particular installations, you might have to meet minimum levels of insulation, for example, so you would have to do that in advance of a different installation. So moving on to our evaluation approach. So the research was commissioned with a number of objectives or aims in mind. The first really is about capturing robust evidence about the impact of ECO to date. So over quite a long period of time, as Owens touched on, this policy's been in force. And the reason, well, one of the main reasons for doing this is to support the development of successor programmes. There's a kind of appetite for this type of programme within Great Britain. And so learning from what's worked well, where the challenges have been, how we can leverage sort of best practice from the current policy and how that might be fed through into future policy. One of the really key things within that was understanding the characteristics of the households that have benefited from the scheme. So the delivery data, which is collected centrally, does cover some of this, but it doesn't, for example, capture the real kind of rich characteristics of the home. So yeah, the physical premises, but also the household composition, so the number of people, their characteristics, to really understand the characteristics of the household in much more detail than you can get from the delivery data. And with that, it's all about understanding the impact of the measures in the real world. So I'll come on to talk about the methodology, as well as doing some survey research. We've done quite a lot of qualitative research as well to really sort of drill down and try and understand how the measures have been adopted in the home, where the challenges might be, and what the impacts have been personally within the household. So in terms of the methodology, there were kind of three strands to the evaluation, two primary research components. So a large survey of households, just under 3,000 in total, and we're presenting the findings from the first wave of the research. We're now sort of into the third wave, so there will be more published data coming off the back of the evaluation. And it took place between March and May, so after the sort of first full heating season, after people have had the installations in place, so they could comment on the impact of the sort of heating bills and during the colder period during the winter. And we adopted a postal online method. We can provide more details if people are interested. And then after each survey wave, we've been conducting a series of deep dive interviews, so qualitative interviews of about an hour long to really go through in a lot of detail and add much more context and richness to the survey data to really understand how the installations have landed within the household. And we're also, in the current wave, looking at doing some ethnographic interviewing, where we'll be taking some video and spending some more time with people to really understand and sort of capture how the installations have benefited and where the challenges might be. And so Owen's now going to go through a selection of the kind of key findings, which draw together those primary pieces of research, but also with the delivery data. There's quite a lot of published data on the number of installations and the types of measure that have been delivered through ECO to date.
Thank you. Yeah. So obviously, just in the sort of interest of time and just sort of covering this, sort of trying to draw out some of the key findings and cover this at a fairly high level. So there's a few things which, I mean, some of this is probably very familiar to people, but I think it does sort of prompt a few questions as well. I mean, one of the first things that came out of this was that really awareness of what options were available to people, and even what a lot of these energy efficiency measures even were, was very low. And the sort of the options for funding, people often didn't really know, they didn't trust what ECO was, they never heard of it, they thought maybe it was a con or something. And so there's clearly a real, this is obviously a barrier, first of all, in us getting to where we need to be, if people don't even know what these measures are or why they, you know, how they can get them and that kind of thing. I think the second thing is coming back to this point about the kind of the co-benefits that we were discussing earlier, the personal benefits, and in particular around thermal comfort and lower energy bills. But I think that there was a lot around thermal comfort, which was very interesting. And some people even said, actually highlighting this primarily is the way to go with sort of promoting interest in these kind of measures. And you know, because a lot of these homes that we treat are very, very, very poor quality, and so people sort of really noticed and benefited from the quite substantial increases in comfort in the home. So just in terms of the numbers here, so 60% of households said they had benefited. Not quite sure what happened with the other 40%. Seems like quite a lot of people who said they didn't benefit, but again, as I said, 2/3 said that the main benefit was having a warmer home, 40% said lower energy bills, but overall, on average, the satisfaction was pretty high with this scheme, which is good. We did find that there was some variation depending on the measures that were installed. And this is quite interesting. So we found that generally the least intrusive measures, such as loft insulation and also new boilers, people were generally quite pleased with, which, you know, isn't necessarily great in terms of our push for net zero. But there tended to be satisfaction tended to be lower with the more intrusive measures, such as solid wall insulation and underfloor insulation. More problems were reported and generally less satisfaction, which is quite worrying, because these sort of what I describe as more deep retrofit is really crucial for us in the UK for getting to our net zero goals. And so clearly something's not going right there. And also measures such as solid wall insulation should deliver the greatest bill savings, the greatest improvements in thermal comfort in a lot of these homes. So the fact that people are less positive about these measures is a bit of a cause for concern. So just to sort of reflect a bit on what this might mean for public policy and the sort of discussions I've been having with some of my colleagues, policy colleagues internally, I suppose. So obviously the first thing is about awareness in the UK at least, and in the UK and amongst this population, awareness seems to be pretty low. So this suggests obviously more needs to be done to promote the options available to people, and in particular the more tangible benefits, which you know, respondents were saying this is how I benefited from this. It wasn't really about environmental or you know, net zero goals. It was about a more comfortable home really, and about cheaper energy. The second point here, which I think is quite an important one, which I'll be interested to hear from people on, is about this question, this issue that came up earlier on about additionality and about demonstrating the additionality of a government scheme. So we found that people were generally pretty happy with the measures they had installed. What we don't know is whether people would be willing to pay towards these measures themselves. It's one thing to be happy with having a load of free stuff or heavily subsidised stuff. It's another thing to say, actually, you know, I liked it so much I'd be willing to pay for it myself, especially if you're low income, or is it just that people will give a sort of a nominal contribution towards it? And I know there's sort of, you know, a lot of discussions internally about where we land in terms of our policies around this, around contribution of households towards measures. And then also this point I said about the sort of seems to be less satisfaction with these more deep retrofit measures. And as I think Alex alluded to, the next wave, the next iteration of Eco 4, which is now live, involves a lot more in the way of multiple measures. So households are sort of obliged to have everything done if they want to. So they want to get an upgrade to their boiler. They also have to have things like solid wall insulation, and there's particular targets around that measure in particular. So we're sort of going all in with this deeper retrofit because we have to. But there's obviously a bit of a issue here if people aren't happy with that, or there's particular reasons for dissatisfaction. And I think we sort of know anecdotally it's probably to do with the installation and the sort of the hassle factor and that kind of thing. So just to wrap up then, so a few questions here for colleagues in the room. Particularly interested in, you know, how much these findings resonate with those from other countries outside of the UK. So first of all, what is the demand for these deeper retrofit measures, and is there evidence that people are kind of that they prefer the less intrusive measures? Do you have any reflections on why that might be, and to what extent households directly feel they benefit from these sort of deeper retrofit? The question around contribution, I think, is a difficult one. As I said, we're wrangling with internally about whether people are willing to contribute, and if they are they willing to contribute anything which actually is sizable enough to make a difference to how much the government can put in. And, you know, we've got various, you know, thinking about various sort of experiments we could do around this internally to try and figure this out, but there's no clear answer really. And then the final question is one which I think is probably something that hopefully, you know, others in the room are thinking about already, but just whether the current situation with energy prices across Europe is driving demand for installations. I think I did read recently that the demand for solar panels on houses in the UK is at record levels at the moment because people are investing because they feel that in the long term it's going to be worth their while. And, you know, as sort of, if we continue to have prolonged periods of high energy prices, is it worth people's while financially? And also, I think there's quite an interesting question about whether governments are taking advantage of this. So are we going with the grain of public opinion if there is sort of a rush on this kind of thing now, or more people are considering it? Are we helping them and driving that kind of extra demand? So yeah, that's everything. Thank you. Do you want to come up as well? So any questions?
Thank you. So, question? Yeah.
Hello, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. My name is Christian Sørensen from Danish Energy Management in Denmark. Those surveys and interviews you did, was it all in 2020?
Yeah, so the data we presented today is based on 2020. Yeah, so the reason for that is the second wave is not yet published. But yeah, in time there'll be the second and third waves coming out.
And is the second wave with the same group?
No, so it's not longitudinal. It's a cross-sectional design. So we're going back to we're picking up a fresh sample of people at each wave, and that's partly because the nature of the obligation has changed over time. So without going into loads of specifics, eco had different components. The first wave covered parts of the second wave of eco and third wave. So what we're doing over time is looking at how the results differ year on year, and whether that can be explained by different parts of the obligation.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just to understand it correctly, because I just think that issue about the deep retrofit, maybe that's at a dissatisfaction. If it's related to the hassle, that should go away in a few years. And then they might actually be more satisfied. Going back to the same group, maybe not exactly the same people, but the same group, initial target group, and select a new bunch of people, might be able to solve that problem.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair observation, and that's something we might want to consider with future evaluations. Because I think a big part of that, which we didn't really sort of go into in a lot of detail, is that one of the big things the survey looked at was kind of unsatisfactory installations, perhaps where the installation process didn't go to plan, or they had problems with the installation after 1 or 2 months down the line. So again, that would be an opportunity to sort of reflect on that once those problems have been dealt with, whether that sort of dissatisfaction dissipates, as you suggest. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Oh, here. Thank you.
Speak.
Hi, thanks very much for the presentation. I'm Joel Franklin from the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. We're very similar situation in a lot of ways to housing stock. But I was curious about that 40% that you said did not notice a substantial benefit or noticeable benefit to the retrofit measures that they took. Do you have any sense for, was that something to do with, I mean, I can imagine that might be some comfort taking. That means that maybe they didn't see it in their energy bills then, or they might be that they don't have a good basis for comparison because energy prices have been going up during this period before and after. I mean, do you have a sense for why that might have been the case?
I can say something on that first, maybe. Yeah, I mean, I can't remember if just on those statistics. The other 40%, I don't know if that is just, that might be some people who sort of say, I'm not sure, it's not quite as black and white as, but there is that point about energy bills is one that we've been discussing a lot now, actually, and I think we're, I mean, yeah, it's impossible to, we've almost moving away from energy, or sort of trying to expand our focus to also to actually ask people about whether it's easier for them to keep their home warm after turning on their heating, like trying to look at other ways of understanding the impacts of the policy outside of energy bills, because it's just too, we can say to people, do you think your bills would have been even worse, than they are now, kind of thing, but it's not a very meaningful question for people, I think, and we also have to be a bit careful about being sensitive to the situation as it is, and not sort of trying to go in all guns blazing, saying, look how great our program is, when actually people are, really struggling. So I think that is definitely a particular issue. But I mean, the timing of this doesn't really align. This was back in 2020. there's other things that were happening. More people were at home because it was the start of the pandemic. It was a very strange time when we did those interviews. So, you know, there's other stuff going on potentially. But yeah, we were definitely, you know, trying to think more about other ways of understanding the effects of this scheme now that energy prices have gone bananas, kind of thing. Yeah, I don't know if you've got anything to add on that.
Yeah, the only other thing to add to that was that I think part of the response was, that it was too early to tell. So there's a kind of a group which didn't feel able to comment fully on the benefits at that point. I think the other thing we found through the qualitative interviewing as well, that people were quite often very focused on the amount of money they were paying on heating. And one of the things we did find, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily borne out in the survey research, but we were finding situations where people were basically paying the same amount and just having the home at a warmer temperature, which is obviously not what you necessarily want to do with this type of policy. Obviously, there will be an element of that, however you try and design this type of obligation, but that was definitely part of it as well, I think.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. My name is Gil Yaron, GY Associates. Just two questions, really. First of all, is there a sample selection bias? Because you talk to people that had entered the program, but what about those people that didn't? And we're kind of really interested to understand why not. And then on the willingness to contribute. So I guess low-income households in old housing stock are really very concerned about the amount they pay per month. So I'm wondering if you're kind of in a policy sense thinking about the kind of innovations with the small companies now offering, you know, to reduce the amount you pay per month. They take the risk, they do the interventions. And I'm just wondering if you've got anything to say on that.
On the selection bias, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, good. Yeah, so
talk about the policy.
Yeah, I think that would, definitely. So the group you've touched on, so perhaps those that were, kind of aware of the policy or had an initial discussion with an installer but decided not to go through with that. They're not a group that was included in the research, but they would definitely be a group which would be interesting to speak to and something we might want to consider for future evaluations. I mean, one of the things that would definitely bolster the findings would have been to have some sort of counterfactual, quasi-experimental design built into the survey. One of the difficulties with that, with the data in Britain, is that what's known about the households which are reached through eco is quite limited. So trying to sort of come up with a counterfactual is quite difficult. It's not to say it's impossible. We have done similar exercises on base studies in the past, but I think that's another area which would definitely sort of bolster the kind of robustness of the data that's coming out of that.
Yeah, I mean, just to say on both those questions, on the selection issue, I think that is a problem. I mean, we do look at how people signed up to the scheme and how they found out about it. So we do sort of explore the user journey a bit. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. I think one thing with the counterfactual as well related to that, we sort of know quite a lot about who the fuel poor or at risk of fuel poor populations are in the UK, and we have lots of different schemes which are trying to reach them. And so part of the issue with coming up with the counterfactual is that there's actually probably won't find many people in that group who haven't been reached by some kind of government scheme. So that sort of also throws a bit of a bit of a problem within there. But on the question about the sort of different financing mechanisms, yeah, I mean, I think it's not something that we're looking at explicitly, but it's a good point. And I think there is sort of interest in exploring different ways of getting people to contribute towards these things in various sort of models. But I don't think the thinking is as advanced as it perhaps could be at this stage on that. But yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Question?
Last question. It's more about sharing a conclusion of work we have done previously with my colleagues. So to create a market for or demand for deep retrofit measures, we must first end all the incentives for step-by-step and shallow renovation. If you have the two in parallel, if you have currently the market is dominated by incentives for shallow renovation. So it's impossible to create the demand for deep renovation. That's the first barrier that we have. The second one, in your list of questions, I think there is an actor that is very important, which is not listed here, which is the renovation industry. Let's call it like that, the industry, because the prices that the cost of deep renovation today is unbelievably high, which makes it impossible to create, again, this demand, especially if you have incentives for shallow renovation. If you don't change these 2 points, then just forget about deep renovation. And the only way in the current situation to make demand for deep renovation happening is to make it mandatory, actually. It's not going to happen. It's just impossible. Because this experience, we keep going around in all EU countries and in the UK, changing the scheme, trying to improve a little bit, trying to improve something that doesn't work. It's not going to make it work because fundamentally it was designed. It's a wrong design, actually, for the target that we have. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't have much to comment on that. I mean, I'm sure you're right. It's the sort of broader
thank you.
Policy issues. Thank you.
So we move to our last speaker, which is Marie-Charlotte Getlin from Grenoble School of Management. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. If you could just help me show my presentation.
I will do it. Yep.
I don't think it's open yet.
I did not send your presentation.
I did send it.
Oh, yes, I got it. I got it. It's my backup.
Well, while Dominique is opening my presentation, already thank you very much for inviting me to this session. Thank you all for being present here. This is probably one of the nicest stages that I've presented on, so I'm going to enjoy this.
Where are you? Oh, you're not here? And this is not you.
No, it isn't me.
Oops. Or maybe, nope, it's me.
No.
Oh. Sorry. Oh, I don't have my...
I can fetch my computer if you can't find it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I have my computer here, so sorry for that.
Should I fetch mine, or? Okay, apologies for a small delay.
Yeah, use the stick.
Okay.
Because we have problem to connect. So we have question on the previous presentation. Feel free. So I can make some announcement. So before ending this session, it will be supposed to be. So that there is another session dedicated to building scheduled this afternoon in room 2. So it's amphitheater number 1, and it will be chaired by Harry Kennard from UCL. And a common and longer discussion would be possible at the end of this session, but I suppose there is only 2 presentations. Okay.
All right, that seems to be working. So again, apologies for the delay. My name is Marie-Charlotte Gütlein. I'm assistant professor at Grenoble École de Management, and I will be presenting results from a recent research project on homeowner preferences for thermal retrofit measures in multi-owner buildings using a discrete choice experiment. Why are we looking at multi-family buildings? Because condominiums, so privately owned apartments in multifamily buildings, account for a substantial share of the residential building stock in France. They are rather old and underproportionally often retrofitted. We know that in general, retrofit rates have to increase dramatically if France, and the same goes for other countries, wants to meet its target to make all buildings nearly zero emission buildings by 2050. And this is especially difficult, or it appears at least to be especially difficult for multifamily buildings. Why? Because we have multiple co-owners with heterogeneous preferences, different financial capabilities, and different incentives to invest. For instance, between owner-occupiers and landlords, we have different drivers, motivations to invest. Against this background, what we tried to achieve with our study was to empirically analyze co-owners' preferences for thermal retrofit measures. We had discrete choice experiments focusing on financing mechanisms, in particular equity capital financing versus loan financing. And in terms of loan financing, we looked at a difference, if there's a difference in preferences for collective loans and individual loans. And we also looked at whether homeowners, French homeowners, would be interested in transferable loans, which are not currently, to my knowledge, available on the French market. So that would be loans that, in case the condominium is sold, would be transferable to the next owner. In addition to these financial aspects, we are also looking into split incentives between owner-occupiers and landlords, and whether an asymmetric distribution of benefits across co-owners has an impact on the acceptability of a retrofit measure in a multi-owner building. What do I mean by this asymmetric distribution of benefits? So imagine you are a co-owner in a multifamily building. If your apartment is a corner apartment on the top floor, and if the external walls are getting renovated and the roof is getting renovated, then you're probably going to benefit more in terms of heating cost savings compared to someone with an apartment in the middle of the building. And we are looking whether such difference in benefits would potentially impact decisions to retrofit or to vote for retrofits of co-owners. If we look at literature on preferences for financing mechanisms for retrofits, we don't find much, especially not much on preferences, homeowner preferences for on-bill financing or property assessed clean energy financing schemes or more innovative financing tools that allow, in a sense, transferability of loans. So we try to contribute to this trend of the literature by looking at different financing schemes and in particular transferability of loans. More precisely, we also consider or look into whether debt aversion relates to preferences for different forms of capital provision. If you look at studies that consider financial barriers, the role of financial barriers in retrofit, they usually focus on owner-occupiers. So one particularity of our study is that we also consider landlords explicitly. By considering landlords explicitly, we also contribute to the existing literature on split incentives that usually compare behaviors, incentives between owners and tenants. So we, in our example, compare behaviors, incentives between owners or owner-occupiers and landlords. So there's a slightly different angle here. Methodologically, we are using discrete choice experiments. Those have been used to elicit homeowner preferences for different characteristics of retrofits, for instance, heating cost savings, gains in comfort, environmentally friendly technologies, etc. So methodologically, we are following this trend of the literature, but I'm going to skip mostly over this for the sake of time. So what are we doing in our study? Well, we implement a discrete choice experiment on retrofit measures in multi-owner buildings with a representative sample of the French adult population. That was done last summer in June 21, and we collected responses from 744 owner-occupiers and 524 landlords. In this discrete choice experiment, our participants, these owner-occupiers and landlords, had to choose repeatedly between different simplified retrofit options that we proposed to them, and these retrofit options differed by costs, by different financing mechanisms, by different absolute heating cost savings and by different relative heating cost savings. So by relative heating cost savings, and I'm going to show that to you in a second, I mean that we informed homeowners whether they would likely save more or less compared to other homeowners in the same building. Regarding the financing mechanisms, we distinguished, as I mentioned earlier, between equity financing and loan financing. Loan financing was always implemented through zero interest rate loans over a period of 15 years, so we did not include any variation in these loan terms. Repaid monthly, either via regular installments in case of a private loan or via condominium fees in case of a collective loan. And lastly, these loans could always be either transferable or non-transferable. So what did this look like in practice? So this would be an example for a typical scenario that a participant in our survey would have seen. So here, I apologize for the French background information. I tried to supplement it with English wording on the different elements. So here, an owner or participant in our study could have chosen between between a first option, a retrofit option that costs 14,000 euros, would be financed through a collective loan to be repaid over a period of 15 years, would likely lead to energy savings of 70% in terms of heating bill savings. Other homeowners would expect similar heating cost savings. And in case the condominium is sold, the loan, the collective loan here, would be transferable to the next owner. That would be the first option. The second option would be a somewhat cheaper retrofit measure financed through a private loan with somewhat lower heating bill savings, but higher heating cost savings compared to other co-owners. And lastly, in this case here, the loan could not be transferred. The third option, finally, is a retrofit measure with a similar price to the second option, or same price as the second option, but financed via equity capital. And in this case, we informed participants that due to differences in measures, the participant would likely benefit less compared to other owner-occupiers. So this is one example for a scenario. Each respondent in our survey saw 8 of these scenarios where the attributes, the numbers essentially you see, changed. And by observing repeated choices of each participant, we can then estimate how participants, owner-occupiers and landlords, make trade-offs, in particular between the costs of the retrofit measure and the other attributes, the type of loan, the energy, the heating bill savings in absolute and relative terms, and the transferability of loans. In addition, after each of these scenarios, we asked our respondents if they would actually vote in favor of such a retrofit measure if it was presented at their General Assembly. So in this sense, they had the option to tell us that they were not interested in this type of retrofit at all. Now, in terms of results, you don't have to look at all these numbers. I'm trying to summarize what we are finding. If you look at these different trade-offs that our respondents made between the attributes, the first thing that we observe is that they prefer lower upfront costs and higher heating cost savings. That is to be expected and also in line with existing literature. That's a bit check whether our study makes sense overall. Second thing we find is that our respondents clearly preferred options when we told them that they would benefit more compared to their neighbors, and the disliked options for which they were told that their neighbors would benefit more. So this, again, is in line with our expectations. Why this is happening is not that clear. So this might actually hint at an additional split incentive problem that's particular to multifamily buildings, in the sense that it can happen in multifamily buildings that costs and benefits are misaligned. And people seem to react to such a potential misalignment of cost of benefits. If they think they are disfavored compared to other owner-occupiers, they react negatively, they are less likely to engage with the retrofit. It could also have other psychological reasons, envy, reference-dependent preferences. So here we'd have to dive
a bit deeper to actually see why this is the case, but it hints at a potential problem that's particular to multifamily buildings. Now, if you look at the financing mechanisms, we see a very, very strong preference for loans that can be transferred. And we see, and this is somewhat surprising, that on average our respondents prefer the options that are financed through equity capital compared to the loan financed options. Economically speaking, this makes little sense because if you paid attention, you will remember that our loans were zero interest loans. So if you are a rational agent and if interest loans are generally positive, you should prefer the zero interest loan in this case. But this is not necessarily what we observe among our participants. Besides, we also see that collective loans seem to be slightly preferred to individual loans. Here again, in financial terms, there was no difference between collective and individual loans, but there might be some psychological factors that lead to a preference, these are slight average preference for collective loans. And lastly, if we look at this alternative specific constants, it just shows us that overall our participants were rather eager to choose investment options and did not very frequently indicate that they would not vote in favor of any of the retrofit options presented to them. Now, in a second step, we try to dive a little bit deeper and see if we can let's say, put our participants into different groups that have potentially different preferences. So can we identify maybe a group of participants that likes loan financing and another group that dislikes loan financing? Or one group that reacts to relative heating cost savings, another group that doesn't react to? And can we link membership in these different groups to individual specific characteristics? So to do that, we implemented a latent class model, and here again, no need to look at all the numbers. I'm just trying to summarize what we achieved through this additional analysis. So indeed, we can identify 3 different types of people, homeowners, in our sample. We observe that there is one group, on the right side, the retrofit opposers. That's a small group, about 5% of our sample, who generally were not very interested in the retrofit options presented to them, so they often opted out. They just seem to disengage with the retrofits. And then among the other participants, we can identify 2 categories: those who preferred the equity financing and those who preferred the loan financing. So we call these the loan lovers and the equity lovers. So you see, we observe that there is a heterogeneity in preferences for financing mechanisms among our participants. Now, it's a bit difficult to explain where this heterogeneity stems from. So we tried to identify individual characteristics that would tell us whether someone is more likely a loan lover, an equity lover, or a retrofit opposer. And what we found is that debt aversion is really, or seems to be, a driving factor. So at least here we see a strong correlation between being debt averse and being a retrofit opposer. So put differently, debt averse respondents were most likely to be retrofit opposers and least likely to be in the loan lover class, which makes sense. If you're debt averse, you don't want to take out a loan. Other individual characteristics such as age, income, gender did not relate to being a loan lover, an equity lover, or a retrofit opposer. In particular, ownership status, so whether someone was an owner-occupier or a landlord, was not related to being more or less in favor of these retrofit measures. And that's also, we run a bunch of additional analysis on that. We could never find evidence, in our data at least, that landlords were less eager to retrofit or were less willing to invest more to obtain higher heating cost savings. And this is something, I'm pointing that out, that is very different from what the literature finds. Essentially, we do not observe a landlord-tenant problem in our sample. Why we don't observe this? There might be a very different reason, maybe because this is a hypothetical experiment. That could be, so there could be methodological reasons, but there are also a number of potential explanations that could make sense. For once, landlords and owner-occupiers face not always the same financial incentives in terms of public support schemes and in terms of regulations. Also, landlords don't face hassle costs, which might motivate them more to invest compared to owner-occupiers that have to live in the building while it is being renovated. And some additional insights from our framework survey hint to the fact that motivations between owner-occupiers and landlords are simply very different. So when we asked our participants why they would retrofit, so what are the drivers for their decisions to retrofit, we observed that owner-occupiers do more frequently indicate drivers related to an improvement of living comfort and a reduction in heating costs, what we would expect, whereas landlords indicate more often drivers related to the real estate value and compliance with regulations. So especially the compliance with regulations appears to be an important driver for landlords, more so than for owner-occupiers. Now, if I want to summarize our findings and include some recommendations based on them, again, we observe heterogeneous preferences over financing mechanisms. Equity financing seems on average to be preferred to collective loan financing, which is slightly preferred to private loan financing, and these preferences correlate strongly with debt aversion. From the slight average, on average preference for collective loans, we think it would be worth considering facilitating collective loans as one mean to push retrofits in multifamily buildings. More clearly pronounced is this preference for loans that can be transferred if condominiums are sold. So facilitate the transferability of loans in the French context could be a promising avenue to support retrofits, for example, through schemes that resemble on-bill financing or PACE financing schemes. We find, again, no evidence for landlord-tenant problems. Could be multiple reasons for this, but I believe it's an interesting finding also because it is not in line with what we usually observe. And lastly, we find that relative heating cost savings do matter. So this is a specific problem, or appears to be a specific problem to multifamily buildings that should probably be addressed when retrofit measures are discussed at the General Assembly in a co-owned house, that it's made clear, well, who pays what and who gets probably which benefits, and to make sure that costs and benefits are properly aligned among co-owners. But here, I think that's also an avenue for future research to really look into this potential of misalignment between costs and benefits in multifamily buildings. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take a question.
Thank you. So, is there any question? Yeah. Oh, I will go upstairs after.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. So just on the landlord's point, because that is quite an interesting finding, I suppose, first of all, just if you could just clarify, so on the, sorry if I missed this, it was quite a simple question, but the loan, so if someone takes out a loan, would that loan go to, the payments for that loan would go to the landlord, presumably, in that case, or would they go to the tenant?
No, it would be the landlord who has to reimburse the loan.
But they, and so this issue of the split incentive, so they would then not be benefiting from the reduction in energy bills. So it must be that the assumption there is that the landlord benefits in the longer term from the value of the property. And do you think that's, I mean, so we're sort of looking at this quite a lot in the UK in terms of our regulations around this. Do you think that that's to do with the amount, the cost of the loan is relatively low, or because what we find is that landlords, you know, don't really want to spend huge amounts of money on retrofit, but maybe it's to do with the financing mechanism, which is you know, making them feel like it's a worthwhile investment. So this sort of split incentive doesn't seem to be an issue in this case, as far as you can see.
Yes, well, unfortunately, we don't know if landlords expected that they could increase the rent following the retrofit. So this is likely the case, that they anticipated some financial returns through an increase in rent, because the tenant has lower heating costs, heating bills, and higher comfort, etc. So they could maybe increase the rent. But we don't know to what extent that played a role. Specifically in the French context, I do think that the compliance with regulation plays an important role. So landlords are foreseeing that they, in the near future, will likely not be allowed to rent out very low-performing buildings anymore. So that might push them towards renovation. That's also what we see when we ask about what are the drivers for them. So it's compliance with regulation and also real estate value, which is related closely to this compliance with regulation.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for that. I'm going to try and see if I can explain this clearly, but I found it really interesting. Thank you for your presentation. When you were showing the options on the options slide, one of the things that I found really interesting, and this is from a UK context where I don't know whether it's happening in France, but energy price rises are just massive, and we're all in fuel poverty now. But one of the things that I was interested in is you had this, what the charges are, and it seems to have a fixed charge of 78 euros per month over 15 years. It made me think of perhaps there's a future preference experiment that could be done, because almost from our perspective, I'd be really happy to know that I was paying 78 euros per month as fixed rate. We know that people prefer fixed rate mortgages over variable rate ones, particularly now. And one of the things that I wondered in this there's a lot of discussion about energy as a service being a new way of being able to deliver energy. Is there an experiment that could be done where you include the eventual costs of energy within that experiment as well? So you say, well, you'll pay this much as a loan recharge, but what you're going to reduce is the variability and also the likely cost of your energy as well alongside that. And what would you think about that? Because you talk about people being really debt averse and things like that, but they're definitely really averse to not knowing what those payments are going to be. So anyway, it's more of a comment than anything else.
Thank you very much. I think you're making a very, very good point. First, maybe for the French context, I do believe that fixed interest loans are much more common than flexible ones. So that I think is rather rare on the French market, but please correct me if I'm wrong. Yes. So these fixed payments, I think, are rather common. Now, I think a natural next step to do would be to link these fixed loan payments to fixed or expected energy savings also per month. So here we indicate something in percentage of heating bill savings, but we don't put numbers on it. If a homeowner had a direct comparison of what he has to pay per month and what he's going to save per month, then it's going to be a very easy decision whether it makes sense to invest or not. So that I think would be a good way to put things, and that would essentially imply that we see retrofits as a service or energy as a service where you pay a monthly fee to get a better service resulting in lower heating bills. So that was also a bit the initial idea behind our study, to see this as these collective or it's loan financing as a service, or yes, to implement retrofits in terms of a service rather than just an investment.
Hi, Kate Jenkins from the Energy Saving Trust. Thanks for the presentation. It's really useful and echoes some of the work that we've been doing in the UK, specifically Scotland, and also that kind of lack of difference, I guess, between the landlords and the owner-occupiers. So it's been interesting to see that it's come out of this on a more quantitative piece of work. So I guess that was just a comment to say that we've kind of seen some similarities. A question that I think may be kind of outside of the scope of the work that you've done. One of the things that we've been doing a lot of work on at the moment is looking at kind of finance as a barrier, and that's always kind of the first thing that comes out when we're doing research. And looking at kind of different ways that kind of finance can be dealt with. Do you have any feeling or kind of research that kind of, if we can get the finance right, is that then the answer and retrofit can then happen? Or is this kind of a first step to other things that then need to happen after that? But that may be outside of the scope of this. Thank you.
I wish I could answer this, but I honestly can't. So I don't know. I think financing is an important part. But if it solves all our problems, I don't know.
Thanks for the presentation. My question is actually about, so what your research was, you asked for individual preferences, but you're talking about multifamily homes. And I'm not sure how it's organized in France, but for example, in the Netherlands, multifamily homes have owner associations. And actually, it's the owner association who has, in the end, to decide about what's going to happen. So there's a legal obligation for maintenance plans. And actually, it gives a scope for also to come up with energy transition plans. But the point is that in the homeowner association, the slowest participant basically determines the speed of what's happening. And then it's not about personal preference any longer, but then it's about a joint decision of the homeowners association. So then you can ask for personal preferences, but in the end, if you have to compromise, and actually you have to follow the slowest one in your association, so what does this research tell us? So, but basically my first question is it organized in the same way in France? So do we also have homeowner associations who have to make the decisions?
So in France, if you want a retrofit in a multifamily building to happen, it has to be voted by a majority of owner-occupiers, of owners during the General Assembly, which takes place usually once a year, but you can have special General Assemblies to vote this. So I'm not sure this is exactly the same organization, but in terms of the underlying problem, you have the same problem that yes, you need a majority of owners to vote in favor. And if you have some who oppose the process, this will lead to failure, so the retrofit not being implemented. In terms of the potential of just slowing down, I'm not sure how this in practice works. So if a homeowner has a complaint, wants the process to be relaunched, if that could just slow things down, I don't know. Now coming back to our study in light of this, how retrofits are voted in reality, yes, we did ask for individual preferences. So of course, just because someone tells us, yes, I like this option, doesn't mean that it would actually be implemented in their building, because that would also depend on the preferences, on the choices of the other co-owners. So in this sense, we could not use our results to, let's say, model potential retrofit rates in multifamily buildings, because we do not look at this dimension of what's the likelihood that there will be a majority of people voting for a specific retrofit option. What we did is we framed our experiments in terms of, okay, you are a co-owner, and we asked this follow-up question: if this was proposed as a retrofit option at the General Assembly, would you vote in favor or not? But we only implemented this collective decision-making process to that extent.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, just wondering if the characteristics of the landlords are a little bit unusual for this type of building as well. I mean, whether you have a lot more kind of small landlords rather than corporates.
So we had different types of landlords, most of them small landlords that own 1 or 2 apartments. So often they own their own apartment and then one other apartment that they rent out. A few landlords that own several apartments, and also very few that indicated owning 20 or more apartments. So that were kind of large-scale landlords, if you want. But majority of the landlords in our sample were small-scale landlords.
Last question, yeah.
Thank you. For your research, have you been in contact with those who are doing the implementation, who are managing? So have you talked to teams like Doremi in France, Energy Sprong? Because there is what you can model, but there is also what is happening on the field. And I wonder if how much the findings correspond to what is really happening these days.
Yes, so in preparation of our survey, we talked quite extensively with people working for associations coaching multifamily renovations for multifamily buildings in the Verre Réseau in particular. the insights we got from there is that the decision-making process is very complex in multifamily buildings. So that's a point also you mentioned. It's a collective decision that takes a very, very long time. Often homeowners don't have a very good understanding of these decision-making processes, of the implications, the benefits of the retrofit, etc. So there are problems, yes, that we did not address directly then in the survey targeted at owners, but that do exist. Maybe one interesting point, we also had a companion survey that was targeted to people who self-qualified as experts in energy efficiency, retrofit. So with about 80 participants working in related fields, asking them about what they believe are the main drivers and barriers for retrofit in multifamily buildings. And there, interestingly, the most important barrier that was cited was lack of workforce. So that or the delays. So even if you, as a multifamily building, you want to implement measures, it's very, very hard to find qualified people to implement those quickly. So that delays the process. And it's also, if you look at scaling up, you will necessarily run into a problem just because there's not enough resources in terms of workforce to increase dramatically retrofit of multifamily buildings, but also single-family buildings. So that applies to both.
Okay, thank you again.
Thank you.